Hi there, I'm Nick, our lead systems builder, and today I'm going to show you how to build this, an AIO cooled build in the Core P6 case. I'm going to walk you through my entire process from how I prep the case, install the hardware, and how I route the cables along the way for a neat and tidy finish. Let's not waste any time, let's get to it. I like to start by removing the back panel of the case. Then I'll go ahead and remove the 4 silver thumb screws holding in the front panel so that I can place this front glass panel off to the side. It's also a great idea to reinstall those thumb screws that hold the front panel back in place so that you don't lose them. There are 3 corner brackets on the outside of the case that need to be removed so we can slide out the glass panels on the front and the top of the case. Each of the brackets has 2 screws that easily come out with a screwdriver. With the corner brackets removed, you can slide out the glass panels. Then I like to remove the top and the bottom dust filters off as you'll bump them while building. On the back of the case, there's a HDD bracket that is holding a box of all your screws, the GPU anti-sag bracket, and some other bits too. To remove the box, you need to remove the SSD tray mounts on the bottom and the top. With the SSD trays out of the way, you can shimmy the box up out of the hard drive cage. I also like to put the thumb screws back from the SSD trays so that they don't go missing. It's at this point I like to flip the case around so I can remove this GPU riser bracket here, as it frees up space for installing your motherboard headers. The screws to remove this bracket are underneath and may take a bit of elbow grease to remove. Now it's time to install the motherboard. I like to place the case on its back for this step. I've pre-installed the CPU, RAM, and any M2s, and you should too. This motherboard already has an I/O shield attached, so all I need to do is align the ATX holes with the standoffs pre-installed in the case. The screws for the motherboard are in this cardboard box we removed earlier. Fish into that and find the baggie of screws you need. We're looking for the motherboard screws, which look like this one here. Typical ATX boards have 9 screws to secure them down. 3 up the top, 3 across the middle, and 3 on the bottom. Once that's done, the next part we want to tackle is the front panel I/O. For this, it's easier to stand the case up. The cables we need are bunched under here, so undo the twist ties holding the cables together and then start to unravel them. You can stretch them out to make it a little easier to maneuver. Start with your USB 2 header cable and route it through this cable cutout here. This spot accesses the bottom part of your motherboard. Go ahead and repeat this step for your HD audio and your front I/O header connectors, making sure to connect them all in once done. As a bonus tip, we'll install our digital RGB controller cable now from our all-in-one cooler, as it makes life easier. This is a good time to clean up some cables and do some initial cable management. I'm bunching up, cable tying, and then routing the cables from the front panel on the left side here. This just keeps things neat and tidy as I go. From here, we're going to get ready to install some intake fans. To prep for it, we'll remove this front bracket that has 4 screws at the top here, and an additional 4 at the bottom that hold the bracket into the case, which we will then slide out. These screws have 2 thicknesses that you'll want to pay attention to. There are 2 larger ones in the middle, while the 2 on the outside are smaller. Then there are 3 more screws on the back side of the case here you'll also need to remove. These are pretty straightforward and there's no difference between these 3. Careful when undoing the last one, as if you're not holding the bracket, it'll fall over just like this. With the bracket removed, we can now install the intake fans. This build has 6 pure ARGB fans in total, so I like to prepare them all at the same time to make installation smoother. We're going to install the intake fans onto the bracket. I find it super helpful to grab a box and place that underneath the fans, so I can overlay the fan bracket on top and screw the fans into it. Make sure you pay attention to the orientation of your fan cables, not only to make cable management easier, but if they're RGB, you'll want to make sure lighting effects line up across all of your fans for that nice synced look. While we are installing fans, I also like to install our top fan intakes as well. Once again, make sure you pay attention to the fan cable orientation here to sync your lighting effects smoothly, and further help with all those cables. I should also mention that with these fans, on both the top here and on the bracket that we just installed the fans to, I don't do the fans up all the way, so they still have a bit of slack in order to move them slightly for cable management later on. With all the fans installed, we can then insert the front fan bracket back into the front panel and begin to secure it in place with the screws we removed earlier. Remember to place the screws back in the right order. The two smaller screws are at each end, while the larger round-headed screws are in the center. Then, to finish the bracket reinstall, screw the 3 screws that go into the back side of the case back in. For this build, we'll be using a 360mm AIO CPU cooler, and the specific model we are using is the Tough Liquid Ultra 360. With the Core P6 and this specific build configuration, I like to install it on the motherboard tray side like so, as it allows the CPU block cables to flow nicely and we can receive cool air from the front too. With the fans, I just make sure that they're intake and that the cables are to the bottom right. The installation of the AIO is pretty straightforward. I've installed the fans using the longer included screws, and the keen-eyed out there will notice that I have ditched the non-RGB tough fans in favour of pure RGB fans. You secure the radiator using the included radiator screws, and once again, I don't do these up all the way, just so I have the option of sliding the radiator a little for cable management. Once the radiator is in, I then start to filter the cables from the fans through the cable cutouts on the right, and will then sort them out later. Now, it's hard drive time. What I like to do is use this SSD bracket that we removed earlier, so either the top or the bottom one. Align the holes with the hard drive, and then use the screws that look like this. We use the same ones for the motherboard, to mount it into the tray. Then, once it's secure, reinstall the bracket to the back of the case. The next thing I like to tackle is the GPU anti-sag bracket, which when installed, goes here. Before we can install it, it needs to be prepped. So, taking the small included pads, place them on all of the contact points, i.e. where the card will be contacting the GPU bracket, so you don't scratch your gorgeous graphics card. Now, when it comes to installing the GPU anti-sag bracket, I actually like to install it upside down, so the end part is facing down and not up. It just works a little better when clamping the GPU. Installing is pretty straightforward. You just use the included thumb screws and place them in one of the 3 slots. You can always adjust this later if it turns out that you need to lower or raise the bracket. Now, everybody's favourite piece of hardware is next, the graphics card. I'm using an Asus TUF RTX 3080 here, which is quite the impressive card, but it's super heavy, which is why we've gone ahead and installed the anti-sag bracket from earlier. Remove the PCIe brackets at the rear of the case, which should be the second and third one for most GPUs. Then, grab your GPU and install it into your motherboard. You might also notice that the sag bracket has been moved for this card, as it needs to be installed a little bit lower than I originally used. Retighten those slot screws to keep your card secured. And to finish this section off, you'll need to get the smaller L bracket that comes with your graphics card bracket and install that to sandwich the card and ensure that it doesn't sag. From here, I like to install the power supply. Start by removing this PSU mounting plate on the rear of the case. It's held in with 4 screws on each corner. Then, with that plate removed, place it on the rear of your PSU, making sure to align the holes of the plate with the corresponding holes on your PSU. For a point of reference, the mounting plate should have the lip side facing towards the sky and the flat side against the PSU. The arrows indicate the bottom of the case, so you can decide which way to orient your PSU based on that. Grab 4 PSU screws and mount the plate to your power supply. For this next step, with the PSU cables already installed, I like to route the cables through the bottom PSU chamber and out of the cable cutout on the bottom of the case. The cutout I'm talking about is located behind the PSU compartment here. With the cables being pulled taut, it makes it a little bit easier to slide the PSU into the compartment. Then you can go ahead and mount the PSU bracket to the case with the 4 screws. We now need to route some PSU cables. We'll start with the 8-pin CPU cable. For this cable, I like to route it under the VESA mount bracket here and then pull it up through the top here behind the hard drive. The PCIe cable is next, and we can route that through the bottom cable grommet here. And finally, the 24-pin cable can once again go under the VESA bracket and through the top cable grommet. Then you can begin to plug the cables in, starting with the CPU 8-pin, before moving on to the 24-pin, and ending with the 2, in this case, 8-pin PCIe cables. Depending on the length of your GPU cables, you can go through the top grommet sometimes. However, with this one, it's so short that we've gone through the bottom. The next part of this cable saga is all the minor cables. This first cable is for the tough liquid water block, so I route that through the VESA bracket and then through the top cutout to plug that into the water block first. I tackle the SATA power cable and the SATA data cable next. These follow the same method of going under the VESA mount. Now we can tackle some cable management. I like to bunch up all the cables that we've routed under the VESA bracket and zip tie them together as it gets them out of the way for when we do our fan cable routing. I use 2 to about 3 zip ties depending on how thick the cables are and how many I have. You can also bunch the cables up to remove some of the slack that they may have as well. Now, it's time for the fan cables. It pays to know which cables belong to which array of fans, as I tend to group them together when routing, in case I need to troubleshoot down the road. All of the cables will be passing under the VESA mount, no surprises there. This motherboard we are using has plenty of fan headers, however, I'll still be using 3 fan splitters, which is what I've just plugged these into now. For the radiator fans, I like to route them under the first rad and then have the cables come up over the top like this. So they remove some of the length, but also have enough to reach the top fan splitter I have installed. You'll want to cable tie these to the cable mount points located on the case. This last bunch of cables are the front panel fans, and so I begin plugging them into the actual motherboard headers at this point. The front intake fans I place in the optional fan header on the motherboard so they aren't tied to the CPU thermals. The radiator fans are what I connect to the CPU fan header, as I want those to react to the temperature of the CPU. And the last group, which are the top intake fans, I connect to a sys fan header. The next part is connecting the ARGB portion of the fans. When you have this many ARGB fans, you may need a specialized RGB splitter like this one we used from Silverstone. It enables us to connect it directly to the motherboard and then splits it into 3 ARGB headers. These headers can be super easy to come apart, which is the nature of 5V headers, so use some electrical tape if you need to keep them connected. Once that process is done, we can bunch up all the RGB cables together and then go ahead and zip tie them. Once you've bunched them up enough, you can push them behind the VESA bracket along with the millions of other cables that we've put behind there. At this point, I go a little further with the zip ties and just bunch everything I can together to tidy it all up, and grab my small side cutters and cut the cable ends to clean up the appearance. We're on the home stretch at this point. Before I put up the back panel on, I just make sure that the dust filter is aligned correctly, as it is magnetic. Let's put this back panel on and tighten up all the captive screws. Earlier, we removed these two dust filters, so we need to put these back on as well. The top one is pretty straightforward, but the bottom one here takes a little awkward hand placement, but it's pretty easy enough. Now, let's take this top glass panel, remove the inner glass protector, and slide it into the place at the top. Repeat the same process for the front panel, removing the inner glass protector. At this point, we can retrieve those 3 corner brackets we removed earlier and screw them back in. These brackets may all look the same, however, the bottom one we removed is slightly different, so you'll need to pay attention to that. To tell which one it is, the bottom one has a slightly small edge on it, which helps keep the tempered glass panel secure. While we're here, it's time to remove those large silver thumb screws on all 4 corners, as we're about to put the final piece back on. For the final part of the installation, peel the inner glass protector off, making sure not to pop the rubber protectors out of the glass, which are on the corners here. Place it on the case, screw the thumb screws back in, and you're done. So that's a wrap on how I build in a P6. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and if you want to watch more videos like this, subscribe to the channel, leave any comments if you have any questions, and like the video, and I'll catch you next time.